Wakatsuki's second cabinet and military. The health of Prime Minister Hamaguchi, after his misfortune in December 1930, remained poor. On April 13, the Hamaguchi cabinet resigned. The next day, April 14, the government of the Minsaido Party, led by Wakatsuki Reihiro, came to power. In the office of Wakatsuki, many members of the previous government took important ministerial posts: Foreign Minister Saidahara, Minister of Finance Inoue, and others. Ugaki's war minister resigned as a result of a struggle between various army groups associated with the March events. Minamihiro was appointed Minister of War. Compared to Ugaki, who maintained more or less close ties with the imperial court and political circles, the new Minister of War was less connected with them. He was an obedient executor of the will of extreme elements from among the military. Therefore, under the new cabinet, differences between the government and the army were sharply marked. On the question of Manchuria and Mongolia, the army began to express its own point of view and carry out actions, disregarding the opinion of the government. The most serious problems that the Wakatsuki government inherited from the previous cabinet were a reduction in salaries to government officials and military reform. As noted in the previous chapter, the salary reduction project caused a huge protest movement in the country and was published only in May 1931, after this issue had lost all its urgency. As for military reform, its main goal was as follows. Following the reduction of naval weapons, world public opinion began to demand a reduction in armies. The same demand was heard louder in Japan itself. Carrying out military reform, the government sought through the rationalization of army weapons, on the one hand, to satisfy these requirements, and on the other, to modernize the armament of the army. But after 185, when the militarists headed for arms and resolving the question of Manchuria and Mongolia, the content of the reform gradually began to change. The main thing in it was the desire to improve the organization and armament of the land army in such a way that they corresponded to modern methods of warfare. After the March incident, the content of the draft military reform was repeatedly discussed, but the implementation of the reform required large budgetary allocations for arming the army with aircraft and tanks, increasing troops in Korea and other events. Therefore, the government, which experienced great difficulties in connection with the Depression, could not begin to implement it. On July 1, the army, without government approval, published a draft reform, which further widened the gap between them. On August 4, at an instructive meeting of the division commanders, Minister of War Minami raised the question of Manchuria and Mongolia, explicitly declaring the need to resolve it with armed force. His speech was widely picked up by newspapers. The statement by the Minister of War was of great political importance. Not only himself, but also the commanders of the regimental districts, as well as officers attached to civilian educational institutions, at every opportunity began to shout about the need to resolve the issue of Manchuria and Mongolia with the help of the armed forces. In the summer of 1931, rumors circulated throughout the country about the planned dispatch of troops to Manchuria and Mongolia. The government and the highest dignitaries still could not decide to start a war. Fearing that in such a situation the army might go too far, they took measures to restrain the military. In August 1931, the captain of the intelligence service Nakamura and his companion, who, dressed in civilian clothes, secretly traveled around this area, were killed by local Chinese forces in a remote area of northwest Manchuria. For 186, the Japanese army, which was looking forward to the opportunity, the Captain Nakamura incident was an excellent excuse. The command immediately imposed stringent demands on Zhang Zuliang, and a wide propaganda campaign began in Japan itself. There was no doubt that the army would begin military operations in Manchuria. But the government and political parties idly watched the actions of the military. Prime Minister Wakatsuki, who was inferior in popularity to Hamaguchi, who concentrated rather strong political power in his hands, could not do anything with the military, and Minister of War Minami, even at cabinet meetings, continued to defend his point of view. All this led to the fact that the army, regardless of government, embarked on its chosen path. 2. Manchu and Shanghai incidents. Explosion in Lutjagog. In the near future, something will obviously happen in Manchuria. The Kwantung Army will certainly take some action. Such rumors began to spread among the knowledgeable circles of Japan since the summer of 1931. In September, cases of movement and maneuvers of the troops of the Kwantung Army became more frequent. The correspondence of the central organs with the Kwantung Army, carried out through couriers and with the help of the telegraph, expanded along the entire South Manchurian Railway. A disturbing situation created. The local population, who felt the approach of war, was seized with fear. One after another, all kinds of adventurers and businessmen arrived from Japan to Manchuria. On September 14, Major General Tatekawa Yoshitsugu, who at that time was the chief of the 1st Department of the General Staff, departed from Tokyo to the Kwantung Army with a secret mission by order of the Minister of War. Rumor had it that his mission was to force the Japanese army to stop developing a Plan 187, which was already half public. However, Tatekawa himself, as well as the Deputy Chief of the General Staff, Lieutenant General Ninomiya Hirosige, and the head of the Military Department of the Military Department, Lieutenant General Kosio Kunanaka, belonged to the category of people who played a major role in the backstage affairs of the army, which was planning some actions in Manchuria. But Major General Tatekawa, who arrived in Mukden on September 18, did not even try to contact the headquarters of the Kwantung Army to transmit this urgent secret order, but spent the night in one of the city restaurants. It was on this night that the incident occurred. On September 18, at 10 p.m., a small explosion occurred in Lutjagao, north of Mukden. Only very few paid attention to him, but even those who heard him decided that the next maneuvers of the Japanese troops were taking place, which continued for several days. However, it was this explosion that served as a signal that heralded the beginning of World War II, which lasted 15 years. But at that time hardly anyone could have imagined this. Even compared to the incident in Sarajevo, which ignited the flames of the First World War, it was a completely minor and accidental event. Indeed, on September 18 at about 10:30 a blast occurred on or near the railway. If this explosion caused damage to the railway, it was so insignificant that it did not interfere with the timely arrival of the train heading south from Chongchum Station. And in itself, this incident did not give grounds for the outbreak of hostilities, noted the report of Lytton. According to Lytton, this explosion, in essence, did not cause any damage to the South Railway. It was not even known who and for what purpose carried out this explosion, but even if it had been possible to establish, anyway, this incident should not have led to such serious consequences. 188. Despite all of the above, the explosion caused immediate action by the Japanese army located in Manchuria, which began with astonishing speed, much faster than was done even during emergency maneuvers. An hour after the explosion, Japanese guard units stationed in Mukden launched an attack on large barracks located in the northern part of the city, not far from the Japanese units. That same night, all Japanese troops stationed in Manchuria launched a concentrated attack on the Chinese military barracks in Mukden, Chogchum, Sipingai, Gunchsulan and other cities. On the morning of September 19, the Japanese state flag was already fluttering over Mukden. By the middle of the day on September 19, the Japanese army completely seized control of the South Ural Railway, and September 23 occupied the city of Jilin. On September 21, a Japanese brigade stationed in Korea without an imperial order, by personal order of the commander of Japanese forces in Korea, General Hayashi Tetsuyiro, crossed the Yalu River and entered the borders of Manchuria. Within 5 days after the incident, all important settlements of the provinces of Mukden and Jiren were captured by Japanese troops. By the time the incident arose, Japanese troops in Manchuria, consisting of 2 divisions and separate guard units, totaled a total of 10,400 people, and together with a brigade that arrived from Korea after the incident, 14,000. However, thanks to the thorough preparation and surprise of the attack, the Japanese forces managed to defeat the nearly 100,000th army of Zhang Zuliang, which, in essence, showed almost no resistance to them. Not to mention the incident itself, the news that the Japanese troops had so quickly captured southern Manchuria astounded the whole world. On September 19, an emergency meeting of the Japanese cabinet was held, at which the political course of the government was determined. It was decided not to allow further expansion of the incident in Manchuria. At the same time, 189, a secret instruction was sent to Japanese diplomatic bodies abroad, which stated that at present, the government's policy is to prevent the further expansion of the incident, if possible, and to cease hostilities where our troops have achieved superiority. However, faced with the fact of the expansion of hostilities in Manchuria, the government, headed by Prime Minister Wakatsuki and Foreign Minister Saidahara, was in a state of complete confusion. Despite the fact that for several days there were emergency cabinet meetings, it was not able to take any effective measures to resolve the incident. At a cabinet meeting on September 21, Minister of War Minami proposed sending reinforcements to Manchuria, but Foreign Minister Saidahara and Finance Minister Inoue opposed the proposal. Nevertheless, the Japanese army stationed in Korea, without waiting for the government's decision, crossed the Korean-Manchu border, and when the Minister of War announced the next day, September 22, at a cabinet meeting, the government was forced to retroactively authorize the army. Finally, on September 24, the government made an official statement on its position on the September 18 events. The statement said the government was keen to prevent the incident from expanding further and wanted to settle it locally. However, This statement had no effect on the military and troops located in Manchuria. The Kwantung Army more and more intensified its activities, expanding the scope of hostilities. On October 8, Japanese troops bombarded the city of Jinzhou, advanced north to Manchuria and occupied the city of Kandahar. The cessation of hostilities line outlined by the government was constantly changing and correcting. The development of military events revealed the contradictions between diplomacy and military circles and showed the political weakness of the government. 190 The government was led by the army, and the main command of the army was led by the Kwantung Army. Powers positioned the incident in Manchuria the next day, September 19, became known throughout the world. On this day in Geneva was to open the 12th session of the Assembly of the League of Nations. In the afternoon, the 65th meeting of the League Council was held. Representatives of Japan and China immediately submitted their first reports to the Council regarding the events of September 18. On September 21, China officially introduced the issue of Japan's aggressive actions into the League of Nations. On September 22, the League of Nations sent identical messages to Japan and China, in which they proposed to make efforts to prevent further expansion of the incident and to immediately withdraw the troops of both states. In response to this telegram, the Japanese government announced on September 23 that Japan has no territorial claims in Manchuria and will withdraw its troops from the railway zone in the shortest possible time. The League of Nations approved this statement. On September 30, the League Council unanimously, including Japan, adopted a resolution calling for no further expansion of the incident. The Japanese government, with its statement and signature under the resolution of the League of Nations, promised the whole world to prevent further expansion of the incident and immediately withdraw its troops. However, events developed independently of Japanese diplomacy. The bombing of the city of Jinzhou on October 8 heated the situation in the League of Nations and led to the fact that on October 15, when voting on a resolution inviting an American representative to a meeting of the League of Nations, Japan was isolated. 30 votes to 1, a draft resolution was adopted requiring the withdrawal of Japanese troops from Manchuria before the next meeting of the Council, that is, until November 16. However, such a firm position of the League of Nations was supported 191 mainly by small countries, whose indignation at Japan's treachery was due mainly to moral considerations. But without the participation of the USA and England, which had direct material interests in Manchuria, the position of the League of Nations would not have been supported by real force. That is why the League of Nations closely followed the position of the American government and, above all, decided to invite the U.S. representative to the meeting as an observer. September 22, that is, shortly after the incident, U.S. Secretary of State Stimson made a statement to the Japanese ambassador to the United States, Deputy, in which he indicated that the American side considers the incident as a result of extremist actions by the Kwantung Army and is confident that the Japanese government itself can cope with the current situation. Thus, the American statement was sustained in very soft colors. Regarding the incident, Stimson said, "We were confident that the Japanese Foreign Ministry and Foreign Minister Saitaro were themselves able to cope with the situation." From these words, Stimson shows that he regarded the incident as the result of a clash in Japan of two forces, He trusted the policy of the Japanese government, which promised not to allow the expansion of the incident. However, the further development of hostilities and especially the October 8 bombing of the city of Jinzhou forced the United States to change its attitude towards Japan. America, which considered itself the defender of the Nine-Power Treaty and Kellogg's anti-war pact brand, took a firm stance on the Manchu issue, speaking out against the imbalance caused by the military operations of the Japanese. After the danger of crowding out American capital from the Manchu market, which became increasingly important to him in connection with the economic crisis, became apparent, the position of the United States became stronger. On January 7, the U.S. Secretary of State issued a statement in which, in response to Japan's actions in 192, Manchuria put forward the principle of non-recognition. However, this statement, known as the Stimson Doctrine, was made under the influence of isolationism, which began to play an increasingly prominent role in United States foreign policy after the 1929 economic crisis. In his statement, Stimson confined himself to proclaiming the principle of non-recognition without affecting the actions of Japan. England's position remained passive. The fact is that starting in 1927, the contradictions between the United States and Great Britain began to become quite distinct. They appeared in the Manchu issue in the Far East. England, whose interests in Inner China were especially great, not as firmly as the United States, advocated treaty compliance. First of all, she sought practical satisfaction of her own interests. Considering Manchuria to be the most suitable place for the Japanese armed forces to threaten its interests in China, England would be satisfied if Japan limited its actions to Manchuria alone. In connection with Stimson's statement, the British government issued a communiqué stating that since Japan has already stated that it will aggressively pursue an open-door policy and stands for the participation of other states in the development of industry in Manchuria and for cooperation with them, England does not consider it necessary to send any official note to the Japanese government. Thus, England, in essence, supported the actions of Japan, which led to the aggravation of its relations with the United States. The League of Nations was completely powerless. It only sat endlessly and made statements, while the United States and England acted separately. As a result, the capture of Manchuria did not meet with serious opposition from international forces. The Japanese army occupied Kakihara, gaining control of the entire Heilongjiang province in northern Manchuria. Having received new reinforcements from Japan in Korea, on December 22, 193, under the pretext of suppressing the rebels in the Liaosi region, she began military operations in the Liaosi region west of the Liao River. On January 3, 1932, Japanese troops occupied the last stronghold of China in Manchuria, the city of Jinzhou. Within 3 months, the Japanese army completely captured the 3 provinces in northeast China. Such a quick seizure of Manchuria was made possible due to the favorable international situation for Japan, characterized by the intensification of the contradictions between England and the United States. However, there were 2 more reasons that made Japan easier to capture Manchuria. First, the internal situation of China. As noted above, the Chinese Communist Party, after the overthrow of the Wuhan government, entered into an open struggle against the Kuomintang government. Thanks to the strengthening of the Red Army and Soviet districts, she was able to create a huge Soviet region centered in Jiangxi province, where strong strongholds were created, covering about 30 counties with a population of several tens of millions of people. For the Kuomintang government, the strengthening of the Soviet regions was a greater danger than the seizure of Manchuria by Japan. Therefore, since December 1930, Chiang Kai-shek began to carry out mass punitive operations against the Red Army. Not limited to this, Chiang Kai-shek from May to September 1931, leading an army of more than 300,000 people, launched an operation to encircle Soviet regions. However, this operation ended in the complete defeat of the Chiang Kai-shek troops. Even after the Manchu incident occurred, the Kuomintang government, despite the demands of Zhang Zuliang, not only did not send a single soldier against the Japanese troops, but began its fifth campaign against the Red Army. The political fragmentation of China and its military weakness so facilitated the actions of the Japanese army that it did not meet any resistance in its path. It is even said that 194 the militaristic cliques of the northeastern provinces surrendered to the Japanese army due to the fact that the Kuomintang government began to carry out measures to destroy military cliques in the country. The second condition that facilitated Japan's seizure of Manchuria can be considered the fear that caused the great powers to strengthen the Soviet Union. The imperialist states began to fear the might of the Soviet Union, which successfully fulfilled its first five-year plan and continued to develop, without experiencing the consequences of the global economic crisis. Under the influence of the Soviet Union, the Chinese Revolution was gaining ever new successes. In this situation, the imperialist states, striving to maintain China in the position of a colony, began to show a particularly great interest in preventing the spread of Soviet influence. Despite the fact that the capture of Manchuria meant for the great powers a reduction in sales markets, it was beneficial for them in terms of creating a bridgehead for the imperialist countries against the Soviet Union. External conditions contributed significantly to this. Thus, the actions of Japan in Manchuria ended successfully and she managed to avoid the intervention of great powers. Secondary prohibition of gold export and in a Kaiyi government formation, the aggression against Manchuria inevitably stemmed from the course pursued by Japanese political figures and capitalists. It was undertaken in order to help Japanese capitalism, which was on the verge of collapse, by conquering the foreign market, get out of the crisis, and also by means of the armed capture of Manchuria to cut down the knot of questions that was associated with its exploitation. In addition, this aggression was aimed at directing the discontent of the Japanese people, who experienced severe material deprivation as a result of the crisis and the rationalization policy accompanying it, onto the path of external aggression. 195. Production. Despite the fact that at that time the unauthorized actions of the military were a serious danger, for their main purposes on the question of the capture of Manchuria, both the military and the capitalists were united. Therefore, although the Japanese government hesitated, but in the end it went on about the military, considering the capture of Manchuria as one of the measures of state policy, it began to cooperate with the military. Japanese capitalism, which in its foreign policy was supposed to accelerate the seizure of Manchuria, in the field of domestic politics was faced with the need to move to an inflationary policy as a new way of robbing workers. Shortly before this, capitalist circles, in order to overcome the financial crisis, lifted the embargo on the export of gold and began to pursue a deflation policy. Now, in the interests of the capitalists, it was necessary to once again ban the export of gold and switch to a policy of inflation. The abolition of the gold standard in a number of countries, especially in England, as well as the occurrence of the Manchu incident, accelerated the implementation of this policy. The financial crisis, which led in July 1931 to the collapse of the German economy, was becoming deeper. In England, which was making desperate efforts to avert a catastrophe, the Labour government resigned and a national unity government was formed. On September 21, 1931, on the third day after the explosion in Lutayagao, this government announced to the whole world the abolition of the gold standard. A statement by the British government has caused a stir in the global financial market. States, one after another, abandoned the gold standard. The general situation also influenced Japan. Rumors began to circulate that sooner or later, gold export would again be banned in Japan. Large banks owned by Zaibatsu, hoping to get huge profits from the secondary ban on the export of gold, began to feverishly invest in securities in dollars. These operations are known as buying dollars by Zaibatsu. $196 buying operations were made possible as a result of a conspiracy between the Zaibatsu and the government. Large banking companies Zaibatsu longed due to the impoverishment of the people to receive huge profits in these operations. When the question arose of ratifying the London Agreement, concluded in July 1930, dollars were sold through the Shokan Ginko Bank. As can be seen from the table below, they were sold for a total of 760 million yen. Moreover, after England refused the gold standard, only Sumitomo Bank Sumitomo Ginko bought up $40 million in dollar bonds, Mitsubishi Bank Mitsubishi Ginko $45 million, Mitsubishi Bank Mitsubishi Ginko $20 million, and the bank Mitsubishi Bussan $30 million yen. In total, these Zaibatsu-owned banks bought dollars worth more than 130 million yen. The buying up of dollars caused great indignation in all walks of life. The militarists and various right-wing organizations, cleverly using this indignation of the people, sought to strengthen their influence. 197. The leakage of gold in connection with the purchase of dollars has become especially large after the abolition of the gold standard by England. On the one hand, this led to a complete disruption of finances, and on the other, it created an extremely difficult situation in industry, which was already in a state of deep depression. The industrial crisis was accompanied by a serious political crisis, and it was precisely with the goal of overcoming this crisis that monopoly capital was to prohibit the export of gold and again switch to an inflationary policy. The global economic crisis, and especially the depreciation of Chinese silver, dealt a serious blow to Japanese industrialists, who invested heavily in the Japanese textile industry, which worked for export. Due to the penetration of English cotton goods into the Eastern markets as a result of the abolition of the gold standard in England, these investors suffered enormous damage. It has already been noted above that the Japanese capitalists, who invested their capital in the textile industry, persistently demanded a ban on the export of gold and dumping based on a low exchange rate, and that the initial project for overcoming the economic crisis worked out by the Hamaguchi cabinet was essentially a failure. As for the reduction in the number of banknotes in circulation advertised by this plan, due to the resistance of lower officials who faced the threat of a reduction in salaries, the military's demands for an increase in military expenses, and also in connection with the allocation of funds for events, the fight against depression continued to increase the number of banknotes. This led to the fact that the government itself was forced to abandon the policy of deflation. The military's demands for a significant increase in military spending, which it made after the capture of Manchuria, suggested a transition to an inflationary policy based on the secondary ban on the export of gold. Similar demands of Japanese capital were expressed in a statement with which the Seiksai Party, 198, then in opposition, she spoke on November 10, 1931. The statement openly put forward the demand to again ban the export of gold. The fact is that the possibilities of a rationalization policy, in other words, a deflation policy, which the two Mansaido parties' offices resorted to in order to overcome the economic crisis, have already been exhausted, and the Japanese bourgeoisie demanded a policy that would correspond to the new situation. The contradictions between the development of Manchu events and Saidahara's foreign policy, the impasse that the country's finances found themselves in as a result of Inoue's financial policies, and the disbelief of the masses in government actions to combat depression shook the position of the Wakatsuki government. The government's activities after the Manchu events revealed its political helplessness. In this regard, some of the members of the then existing political parties, which were dissatisfied with the government's policy, began to insist on the creation of a coalition government, following the example of a national unity government formed in England. The creation of such a government was demanded by a member of the Tsukai Kuhara Fusanosuke party, brother-in-law of one of the representatives of the new concern Zyu Kawajisuke, Minister of the Interior Adachi Kenzo, being a member of the Mansaido party, and others. Adachi, who held such an important post in the Wakatsuki government as the Minister of the Interior, was dissatisfied with government activities initiated by Prime Minister Wakatsuki, Minister of Finance Inoue and Foreign Minister Saidahara. He contacted an army group of reform advocates led by Lieutenant General Araki, as well as opposition party leaders Tocoms Takehiro and Kuhara Fusanosuke, and stubbornly insisted on creating a coalition government. The goal of the Adachi group was to bring about a change in the government of the Mansaido party, which did not have long to remain in power. This group intended, 199, having contacted the Tsukai party, to seize the political leadership in the country and, if possible, to form a new cabinet. However, within the Tsukai party, Morikaku and Suzuki Kozaburo made every effort to create a new cabinet, which would consist entirely of representatives of the Tsukai party. Mori and Suzuki recruited party leader Inakai. Thus, the idea of forming a coalition government was not successful. The actions of Interior Minister Adachi led to a split in the government of the Mansaido party. It began to fall apart from the inside and finally resigned on December 11. In this regard, Adachi and Nakano Masatake, who insisted that the Mansaido party, as the direct culprit of the government crisis, lead the coalition government, left the party and created a new party, the People's Union, the first fascist political party. But Adadi's actions did not find sympathy with the Sukhayi party, and a day later, on December 13, she formed her own government led by Akai. This government was the last party government in Japan. During the formation of the government, Lieutenant General Araki Sadao, who represented the group of supporters of reform in the army, was appointed Minister of War, and Morikaku, who actively advocated aggression on the mainland, was appointed Secretary General of the Cabinet. The fact that during the formation of the cabinet preference was given to the military and the right-wing elements testified to the weakness of the government. As expected, the new government on the very first day of its existence banned the export of gold. So the first step was taken towards a policy change. His next step was a ban on the exchange of paper money for gold. All this led to inflation. The Akai government was to come to power, and it really came to power as a result of the collapse of the rationalization policy and the development of events after the Manchu incident, as well as in connection with a change in the policy of the bourgeoisie. Although this government did the view that it weakened its ties with the extreme right-wing forces led by the military, however, it revised the entire policy of the Minsido Party and began to advocate the expansion of aggression in Manchuria. The Sukhayi Party, which was a minority party in the past, convened the 60th session of the parliament and hastened to dissolve it. In the election, this party, which conducted an election campaign under the banner of combating depression, received an overwhelming majority of the vote. If earlier it had 171 seats in parliament, now this number has increased to 303. While the number of Mansido Party mandates has decreased from 247 to 146. Thus, the Akai government, having secured an overwhelming majority in parliament, began to pursue an inflationary policy, which implied a significant increase in emergency military spending necessary to expand aggression in Manchuria. Shanghai Incident. The ease with which Japan captured Manchuria further strengthened the desire of the Japanese imperialists to undertake aggression against China. The success of the Japanese army in Manchuria, the huge amount allocated for extraordinary military expenses, which was made possible by the military, thanks to this, lifted the spirit of the always opposing army of the Navy, who decided to do something in Shanghai, which was within its sphere of influence. The tensions in China pushed the Japanese fleet even more aggressively. Shanghai is the largest city in China. Shanghai workers and students have always been distinguished by high consciousness. So Shanghai most strongly opposed the Japanese aggression in Manchuria. September 22, that is, immediately after the incident in Lutaogao, a mass anti-Japanese rally was held in Shanghai, at which the League Against Japan was created to save the homeland. From this day on, anti-Japanese demonstrations and rallies began to take place in the city more and more often. All 201 it unnerved the Japanese residents, diplomatic missions and landing forces of the Japanese naval forces located in Shanghai. On January 18, 1932, several Japanese bonzes were injured in Shanghai. On January 20, Japanese residents in Shanghai, using this incident as an excuse, convened a rally and decided to ask the Japanese government to bring troops into Shanghai. Up to this point, the Japanese fleet in China had a detachment of gunboats standing on the Yangtze River. On January 21, under the pretext of protecting Japanese residents in Shanghai, the Fleet Command decided to send an additional Ooi cruiser and the 15th Destroyer Squad consisting of 4 ships to China. On January 23, this detachment arrived in Shanghai, landed a Marine unit. On January 28, the second landing was delivered here. In total, in the Japanese settlement in Shanghai, up to 2,800 Japanese Marines were concentrated. Relying on this landing and taking advantage of the incident with injuring Japanese bonzes, the Japanese authorities demanded that the Shanghai municipality withdraw Chinese forces from Shanghai. On the same day, the Japanese side unilaterally expanded the borders of the area protected by the Japanese Marines beyond the Japanese settlement in Shanghai and announced that at exactly 0 hours on January 29, it would begin deploying its troops in the specified area. Without waiting for a response from the Chinese authorities, the Japanese command began to carry out its plan. On the same night, the clash broke out between the Chinese forces guarding the area of the northern part of Sichuan and the detachment of Japanese troops advancing into the area. The clash immediately took on the character of a street fight. At dawn, Japanese aircraft based on an aircraft carrier bombed the city. Despite this, the Japanese troops were given a fierce battle. The Chinese 19th Army, which guarded the Shanghai area, unlike the troops led by the Manchu military clique, which was fled by the Japanese, had a high sense of national identity and enjoyed 202 the sincere support of the Shanghai workers and the entire urban population. All this led to the fact that this time Japan was miscalculated greatly. Due to the fact that the interests of the great powers in Shanghai were very significant, diplomatic representatives of foreign states called for a settlement of the incident. So an interim agreement was concluded on the cessation of hostilities. But this was not part of Japan's plans. The Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy in China, Vice Admiral Nomura, said, "For some time, we should not oppose the negotiation of a ceasefire, so as not to get on the nerves of England and the United States. We must wait for the arrival of the troops, and then, having demonstrated the power of our army, we will destroy everything that in the future could cause new unrest. I think that such a solution is the only right one. In any case, it is necessary to wait for the arrival of troops and only after that deliver a decisive blow." 54. As expected, the Cabinet of Ministers at its meeting on February 3 decided to send reinforcements to China. Already on February 7, the Japanese Mixed Brigade landed in the Asuna area, north of Shanghai, and launched an attack on the 19th Army. On February 13, the main forces of the Japanese Army arrived in Shanghai, the 9th Division. The forces of these forces launched a general offensive. However, these troops were not able to deliver a decisive blow to the Chinese army. The resistance of the Chinese troops was stronger than expected by the Japanese command. Japanese troops could not advance a step further than the coast. Therefore, Japan sent new reinforcements to the Shanghai area. The 11th and 14th Divisions under the command of General Shirakawa Yoshinori were sent here. Having launched aviation, the Navy and all types of modern weapons, the Japanese Army launched a new offensive. By March 1, 203, Japanese forces were finally able to capture the northern part of Shanghai. The position of the Inukai cabinet and Yoshizawa diplomacy regarding the Shanghai events was more active than that taken by the Wakatsuki government, embarrassed by the unexpected events, and Saidahara's diplomacy during the Manchu incident. Japanese troops deployed to Shanghai consisted of 3.5 divisions and several dozen military ships, and twice the number of Japanese troops that seized Manchuria. However, this time the course of hostilities took a completely different turn than in Manchuria. Japan's hopes for the success of the aggression were in vain. The Japanese army, waging fierce battles, faced strong resistance not only from the Chinese troops, but also from the entire Chinese people. In addition, most of the great powers refused to recognize the unauthorized military action of the Japanese. The public of all countries sharply criticized the actions of Japan. England and the United States, extremely interested in this area of China, have expressed a sharp protest against the advance of Japanese troops to the banks of the Yangtze. On February 2, the ambassadors of England, the United States, and France to China proposed a joint draft resolution to the conflict. In the future, they repeatedly made a proposal for a ceasefire and the establishment of a neutral zone, expressing protest against the actions of Japan. As noted above, on February 24, U.S. Secretary of State Stimson issued a statement condemning the actions of Japan. On March 3, a session of the League of Nations Assembly opened in Geneva to discuss the Sino-Japanese conflict. The unfavorable international situation for Japan, as well as failures at the front, forced it to abandon the continuation of hostilities. Due to the fact that on March 3 a situation was created that allowed the cessation of hostilities without prejudice to prestige, the command of the Japanese troops in 204 Shanghai issued a statement to terminate the operation. Through the mediation of diplomatic representatives of third countries, the discussion of the issue of concluding a ceasefire agreement began again. The negotiations between the representatives of the military command of Japan and China progressed with great difficulty, either interrupted or resumed. However, on May 5, the Sino-Japanese cessation of hostilities agreement was finally officially signed. Japanese troops were withdrawn from Shanghai, and thus hostilities in Shanghai ceased. The Shanghai incident, thanks to the resistance of the Chinese people and primarily due to the courageous struggle of the 19th Army, which fought on the front line, ended in complete failure for Japan. In these events, the Kuomintang government took, as always, a defeatist position. It not only did not show determination to organize nationwide resistance of the Japanese army, but rather adhered to the course of annihilation with the help of Japanese troops of the 19th Army, which was heavily influenced by the Chinese Communist Party. The Kuomintang government did not provide any assistance to the troops fighting on the front line of the struggle against Japanese aggression. However, in contrast to this position of the government, workers and students of various cities of China organized heroic assistance to the troops of the 19th Army, providing it with material and moral support. In addition, many of them fought at the front as volunteers. Thanks to this support, the troops fighting on the front line of the battle achieved brilliant success, having pressed significantly superior forces of the Japanese army, equipped with all types of modern weapons, to the coast. The military defeat of Japan drove the arrogance from the Japanese military and temporarily suspended the advance of Japanese troops into China. This was one of the main reasons that made Japan focus on the use of Manchuria. 205. The increasingly active intervention of the great powers was also an important factor in the defeat of Japan. At that time, the ruling classes of Japan did not yet dare to aggravate relations with England and the United States that could lead to war. As events unfold, the Genro, Jushins 55, and other representatives of the imperial court, as well as representatives of the Zaibatsu, were often forced to restrain the military with the aim of ending hostilities that seriously aggravated the international situation. The entire Japanese people resolutely opposed this aggressive war. The awakened working class of Japan, despite the repressions that began immediately after the Manchu events, courageously fought against the war. During the Shanghai events, he connected his struggle with the anti-Japanese struggle of the Chinese people and fought against Japanese imperialism hand in hand with him. The broad masses also opposed the Shanghai events. Even the influential newspapers, in every possible way praising the Manchu incident, were somewhat critical of these events. The unfavorable situation inside the country and the defeat at the front forced the military to temporarily abandon the continuation of aggression.